The Rushdie Affair, a turning point for British Muslims, is a good title, and what I think I want to argue is that, if you like, the roots of the Rushdie Affair predate the actual furore around the book, and in one sense show us. It was a moment of crystallisation, if you like, between Muslims, the British state, what is going on in the world, identity, the anti-racist movement. So it was that kind of watershed moment. And what I want to try and frame it, how I want to try and frame it, is to use Alex Klinikos's dictum that every historical event, because it certainly was that, is a peculiar blend of the universal and the particular, or you might even say the global and the domestic or the local. Because if you look at the Rushdie Affair, what's interesting, as I was preparing for this meeting, is how many of the issues and arguments and positions that were taken and how it developed really. You can recognise, even if you don't know about the Rushdie Affair, you'll recognise them in terms of the narrative around Muslims, Islamophobia, the West, the Enlightenment, all the kind of narratives which we're trying to grapple with at the moment. So it's quite instructive in a whole number of ways. But what I want to do first is to basically try and explain what happened. Because I'm aware that, unless you're as old as me and some of the other people in this room, you wouldn't necessarily know about the Rushdie Affair, what it was about, and why it happened, and the kind of circumstances, the broader circumstances which surround it. So I'm going to have to go through the kind of a little blow-by-blow, if you like, account, just so that we're kind of all on the same page, I guess. So, who was Salman Rushdie? So Salman Rushdie was a author of Indian origin, I guess you would call him upper middle class background, who came to Britain and became British to all intents and purposes, was at the time of the Rushdie Affair 30 years ago, September 1988 it kind of started, he was increasingly a well-known and well-regarded novelist. Before the Satanic Verses, which is his third book, he'd had a couple of other books, the second of which, Midnight's Children, had won the Booker Prize and was fated as being an extraordinary novel. And to be honest, it is a kind of combination, if you like, of the kind of literary genre which is developing at the time, called a postmodernist, magical realism, by which kind of magical things could happen in out of ordinary circumstances. That could kind of you could kind of go off, if you like, into kind of magical realms from an everyday circumstance. And also, in Midnight's Children, it was a critique, if you like, of partition and the British. And Rushdie was also, if you like, a political writer in the sense that he critiqued British society. And part of the Satanic Verses, the book, is a critique of Thatcher's Britain. And he was, as I say, he was increasingly fated. Funny enough, the first time he kind of sticks in my mind, was there's a book called Stay in Power by Peter Fryer, History of Black People in Britain, which is the kind of, the go-to text, even now, to be honest, in terms of history of black people in this country, going back to Tudor times and before that, right up to 1970s, 80s. And on the book jacket, there's a very warm and fine recommendation of Peter Fryer's book by Salman Rushdie. So clearly, in one sense, he kind of, he was kind of us in terms of the anti-racist, progressive left, however you want to call it. So when and I'm trying to think back now, and comrades who are around at the time will chip in during discussion. When I think about it, the Rushdie Affair seemed to erupt out of nowhere. to be honest, I don't think we knew it was going to happen. Anyone knew it was going to. Rushdie certainly didn't know it was going to happen and spin out of control in the way it did. I can't vouch for what Rushdie was trying to do in the book itself, but I don't think anyone really. We were all caught off guard. I remember comrade, some of you know, Rahul Patel, phoned me days after the whole thing burst open, and he said, because he said, you've got a Muslim name, will you sign a petition in defence of Rushdie and against anti-Muslim racism, as it was called at the time? There was a sort of torrent of anti-racism Muslim. So, if you like, trying to hold the ground in supporting Rushdie's freedom of expression, but also trying to if you like, ally ourselves with the grievances of Muslims and against, if you like, the whole torrent of what we would call now Islamophobia, which had reached complete fever pitch within months, I guess, or weeks even, of the publication of the book. And then, so I said, yeah, fine, absolutely, yeah, why not? And then he phoned me a couple of days later. He said, Hass, it's not going to happen. Yeah, you've got Gareth here in the front. He knows more about it than me. It's not going to happen. We're a little bit afraid that if your name appears, then you might attract some death threats, whatever it is. And to be honest, my at the time, I kind of said, well, look, whatever happens, you can use my name anyway, to be honest. But if you like, that's a little indication, one, of how heightened the atmosphere was around the publication of his book and the protests against it by Muslims, particularly in the north of England, which I'll go into a little bit later, and how quickly, if you like, what a number of commentators have called the middle ground disappeared. The polarisation was extreme and rapid. So those of us who are trying to not hold the ring, but to have a principled defence of Rushdie, but also wanting to align ourselves with working class Muslims against the torrent of abuse that was being levelled at them, that ground disappeared. And I think that's indicative, if you like, of how fast events span out of everyone's control. And to be honest, the interesting thing is that Tories were forced to defend Rushdie, but the Tories didn't like Rushdie. They saw him as being of the left. And in fact, ministers stood up in the House of Commons and said, we don't like Rushdie, but we at all, but we will defend him over his right to freedom of expression, which was, to be honest, was not all of the argument. Let's put it that way, which was happening at the time. But that's an interesting aside. The book, The Satanic Verses, was immediately nominated for the Booker Prize, because he'd won the Booker Prize with his previous novel, Midnight's Children, and then the Whitbread Prize also. So it was well received, I guess, by the literati, by the critics in its initial phase. So Penguin published The Satanic Verses on September the 26th, 1988. So it's really almost 30 years. And immediately, protests kind of erupted, most of which, to be honest, were under the radar in terms of the British press, which is not unusual for the British press, of course. Under the radar of the British press. In October the 5th, 1988, so that's only a couple of weeks later, India banned the Satanic Verses. Actually, the government banned the Satanic Verses on the advice of a very well-respected journalist called Khushwant Singh, who said that if you publish this, then, to be honest, it's going to tip India over into communal violence, and Muslims will be at the receiving end of it. Because at that time, there was a Hindu nationalist revival going on, and all sorts of persecution of Muslims. That was then followed by South Africa, who then banned it. And then, of course, all of the Muslim countries basically banned its publication. In January of 1989, so we're talking about 3 months later, W.H. Smith took Satanic Verses off their shelves of all their outlets across Britain. And a week before that, 1,000 Muslims had gathered in Bradford and to protest against Satanic Verses and to call for Rushdie to be prosecuted under blasphemy laws. The problem which was that the blasphemy laws didn't only apply to blasphemy according to the Christian religion. That's I think, is that the case now? I don't know whether blasphemy laws still exist, but anyway, at the time it was only extended to offence towards Christians, not to Sikhs, not to Muslims, not to Hindus or any other religion. And at that demonstration in Bradford, the book was, if you like, ceremonially burned by some of the protesters. Now, actually, I think it's a week before that, a similar demonstration had taken place in Bolton, in Lancashire, and the book had been burned there. But the journalists, the press missed that. But they converged on Bradford, because Bradford also had a recent history of tensions, if you like, between the Muslim population, and which I'll go on to later, and local government and the education system. So Bradford became a kind of focus. And of course, as soon as the book was burned, then the Muslims who'd done it, and then by proxy, all Muslims across the country, across the world, Muslims as a group, then became known as the book burners, the Nazis, and those kind of metaphors, if you like, or historical comparisons were drawn between the Muslims burning Satanic Verses and Hitler's burning of books, Fahrenheit 451, whatever. Then the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar University, which is the principal Sunni university in Cairo, in Egypt, he denounced the book, called for it to be banned, but that was it. But he was, the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar was trumped, if you like, by Ayatollah Khomeini. As people know, had come into power through the Iranian Revolution and was in charge of basically a theocratic state in Iran. And the Ayatollah Khomeini called for, sentenced Rushdie to death, and said it was incumbent upon every Muslim to try and kill Rushdie for blaspheming the Prophet Muhammad. Now, that death sentence by Ayatollah Khomeini was, although it was kind of spun as a religious edict, wasn't. It was a political move, if you like, by the Iranian theocracy to try and establish themselves as being the predominant, if you like, spokespeople for the Muslim world. She has been a minority, obviously, within the Muslim world. And it was an attempt also, if you like, to undermine or to leap over the Saudis who were trying to say that they were a centre of the Muslim world. And so there was, if you like, there was a kind of internecine power struggle between these two theocratic bodies within Islam. And, if you like, Khomeini trumped the Sunnis by calling for the death sentence. But although it was spun as a religious edict, to be honest, it was a political move. But what that meant was that suddenly the stakes had been upped. Salman Rushdie kind of officially went into hiding, although I think he was in hiding before that, really. He was in fear of his death. And for many, many years after that, a British security service detail guarded Rushdie against his assassination. And to be honest, that wasn't if you like, a fanciful thing, because people associated with the book, particularly translators of the book, I think one in Japan, if I'm right, were assassinated following Khomeini's edict. So you can see, if you like, how quickly the situation had spun out of control, and how quickly, if you like, the middle ground had disappeared. To be honest, if you were a British Muslim, to bring it back to this country, unless you agreed that the book should be banned, really you didn't have a toehold in the conversation that was going on. That was the kind of bottom line. The majority of Muslims in this country didn't believe that Rushdie should be killed for apostasy or blasphemy. If you look at, there was a poll taken at the time which said the majority of Muslims in this country didn't believe that should be the case, but unanimously they agreed that the book had given religious offence and should be banned. Now, if you just leap forward a little bit, quite interestingly enough, and I want to come back to this in an historical sense, there were, if you like, people within the Muslim world who were trying to stick up for Rushdie, in one sense. So, for example, the Nobel laureate Naguib Mahfouz, the famous Egyptian novelist, actually got together, if you like, over 100, I think it was, Muslim academics and authors and literary figures to try and defend Rushdie and try and, if you like, to try and create a countercurrent to the main debate that was going on. But really, it was important that they did that, and they were very brave to do that. But it had little impact, if you like, on the main discussion which was going on. And it wasn't until 1998, which is 10 years afterwards, that Iran lifted the fatwa, as they called it, on Salman Rushdie. So hopefully that gives you a kind of overview, a blow-by-blow account of events surrounding the publication of Satanic Verses. And to be honest, there are also people on the left in this country who try to do the same as Mahfouz did in Egypt, try to both defend Rushdie and abhor the outpouring of Islamophobia which has been heaped upon the Muslim community in this country. Now, what about the content of the book itself? Because I guess you're interested in why it caused so much offence. Now, interestingly enough, or to be honest, it wasn't about the Satanic Verses. The Satanic Verses, okay, so we're going to get into theology now, but very briefly. The Satanic Verses are supposed to be a series of verses which were handed down to the Prophet Muhammad, not through God, through the angel Jibril, in Islamic terms, but through Shaitan, through the devil. In other words, the Prophet Muhammad had been, if you like, hoodwinked by the devil. It's a bit like Jesus, you know, when he goes into the desert and the devil tempts him, kind of thing. So it was that Shaitan, the devil, had whispered these verses into the ear of the Prophet Muhammad. And the basis of it was that the Prophet Muhammad was trying to convert his own clan, the Quraysh, to Islam. Previous to that, they'd been idol worshippers in his terms, and he wanted to try and convince them of a monotheistic outlook. There was one God, and his name is Allah. And the Satanic Verses are supposed to be a kind of a kind of compromise by which Muhammad could, in some circumstances, embrace idol worship and therefore attract the Quraysh over to Islam without them having to give up their idols. Now, so that's what the Satanic Verses are. They don't appear in the Quran because Muslim scholars from the time of the if you like, the construction of the Quran disregarded these verses as being truly the word of God, because they said it was the word of the devil. There's only one religious authority that mentions really the Satanic verses, and that's a man called Al-Taberi, who was trying to collect all the stories about the Prophet Muhammad together into what we know now as the Hadith, the kind of commentary on the life of the Prophet Muhammad, which goes alongside the Quran. And but Al-Taberi in Muslim scholarship is seen as someone who collected lots of stories, some of which can be traced back to the Prophet Muhammad. There's a chain of transmission from one person to another. We can prove that this is what the Prophet Muhammad did or said. And but the Satanic verses is generally disregarded in Islamic theology as not being genuine. It's, if you like, hearsay as opposed to being proved something that the Prophet Muhammad did or said. So in one sense, the Satanic verses, although that was the title of the book, was not really the basis, if you like, the root of the offence which was given to Muslims. But really, in very simplistic terms, the root of the offence was that Rushdie, in his kind of magical realist way, had played loose and fast with the Quran, which Muslims regard as being directly the word of God, and that he'd created a character called Mahood, who was clearly supposed to be the Prophet Muhammad, who was a lecherous, corrupt libertine, who a thoroughly bad, corrupt, amoral character. And so what Rushdie had done, presumably in the same way as he kind of merged fantasy and reality, he'd merged together the Quran with this character, Mahood. So he kind of merged, if you like, Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, with his character Mahood. And that really was the basis of the offence given to Muslims. One, that he had corrupted the word of God in terms of the Quran, and also that he had, if you like, he had disrespected the Prophet Muhammad by basically saying he was a libertine, an infidel, a non-believer. Now, the notion of Muhammad being a libertine, a non-believer, and so forth, actually a false prophet, if you like, goes way back into Orientalist takes on Islam as a religion. Goes way, way back to basically, well, we can talk about the 12th century. In France, there was a song cycle, which was a kind of lampooning of the Prophet Muhammad as being a false prophet. And the character in this 12th century song cycle is called Mahood. So presumably Rushdie had researched that, and he decided that was the vehicle that he was going to use. So, in one sense, if you like, the Prophet Muhammad had been merged, and it had these historical antecedents into the devil. So that really was the basis of the offence that was taken by Muslims across the world. Now, and it had very deep roots, if you like, in terms of Western commentary about Islam as a religion. Now, I don't know whether Rushdie realised what he was doing. I doubt he did, in the sense that he wrote a book which would then bring down a death sentence upon him. Right? But I guess the argument, which is not an argument I would promote, but the argument at the time was that he knew what he was doing, and therefore it was an incitement, a provocation. And if you like, that notion of incitement and provocation and a reaction against it is something which we understand, I think, today in terms of narratives around Muslims across the world and Islamophobia. We've had the debates about Charlie Hebdo and so on and so forth. We kind of know, if you like, and understand where the grievance comes from and the intent which is there to stir up that grievance, if you like. So again, come back to our original point. This is a narrative which emerges out of Salman Rushdie's Systemic Verses, which I think we're well used today. And of course, many on the right took Rushdie's book as a way to bash Muslims. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I remember at the time being completely shocked by. I mean, you see, I thought I was naive. I thought that the liberal literary intelligentsia were basically on my side on this, and were basically, civilized and whatever it was. All civilized debate went completely out of the window when it came to the aftermath of Rushdie's publication of Rushdie's book. I remember, for example, just to give you one instance, there was an imprint of like agitational pamphlets called Chateau Counterblasts, which is a series of very good pamphlets, actually. And Paul Foote, at the beginning of 1988, had published a very good pamphlet on why the British should get out of Ireland. Now, the next in that series was a pamphlet by Faye Weldon, the feminist author, called Sacred Cows, which she uses around about, I guess, 80 to 100 pages to basically heap scorn, racist bile, accusations of stupidity, uncivilized behaviour, infantile behaviour. She ridicules Islam. She says, God, for God's sakes, bring the bloody church back, she says. And at least we can sideline these Muslims in our country. She said, even though I'm an atheist, I want the church, I want the high church back, so we can push these Muslims out of our national debate. And it was extremely upsetting and to read, to be honest. And so you saw a whole number of what a phenomenon which we know now of the liberal intelligentsia basically coming out, trashing Islam in the name of freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And in one sense, those doors were wide open for them to do it. And that was the national debate, that was the international debate. No attempt to understand either where the grievance came from on a local or particular, or on a universal, on a global level. No attempt to try and understand Islam as religion or to give it any kind of whatever. No attempt to disassociate some Muslims from other Muslims. All Muslims, if you followed Islam, you were an idiot, a savage, an uncivilized beast. Islam was a religion of violence, whereas Christianity was a religion of peace. This is what Faye Weldon said in her Chateau Counterblast. Poor old Paul Foote, he said, he must have thought, my God, why did I bloody publish in this? But anyway, and but this is again a narrative which I think we know about. Now, one of the things which it clearly did, the whole theory clearly did, was to bring to the fore a British, if we talk about this country, a Muslim identity. So, in the past, and what you have to understand, I guess, about identity, I don't know if people agree with me, identity is mostly put upon us, right? We don't actually forge our own identities. Identities are usually kind of given to us, in some way or another. And I think what we then try and do as a process is we try and, if you like, deal with that identity by trying to find some kind of positive thing in it. And to be honest, that in one sense is not a bad thing. It wasn't a bad thing, I don't think, that a Muslim identity came to the fore in this country, and I'll tell you why. If you look at the history, particularly in the northern cities, down in London I think we're a little bit more insulated, but to be honest, life for the average working class Muslim in the northern cities of places like Bolton, Bradford, Burnley, Blackburn and Rochdale had, in the decades preceding it, been an increasing horrible experience, living experience. In the northern cities, you'd had the National Front running riot literally, packy bashing, as they did everywhere in the UK, but in the northern, they were much more isolated as communities. So, they're much more easier to pick off in one sense, You'd had old Labour councils who had deliberately segregated Muslims from the white working class population through their housing policies, deliberately. This had led to segregation in schools, for example, where I remember I worked above a school in Rochdale in the early 1990s, where 95% of the population were Pakistani Muslims, so you had segregation in terms of housing, spatial if you like, you had segregation in terms of education, you had segregation in terms of the workforce, and people know during that time the main industries in the north, which were the mill industries, were collapsing, and mills were being shut down, whether it's the wool mills in Bradford or it was the cotton mills in Lancashire were being shut down because of global competition. Globalized garment trade, beginnings of it, and those Muslims were working class Muslims were being thrown into marginal jobs like taxi drivers typically, or working in the restaurant trade, or working wherever they could, to be honest. So on a whole number of fronts, it was a horrible experience and a worsening experience to be a working class Muslim, particularly in the north of England. And the attitude, for example, of the old Labour councils towards the Muslim populations was, we'll take your vote, but at the same time, we'll treat you basically as cannon fodder, as children. We'll take you completely for granted. We won't change any of your living conditions whatsoever at all. But we'll demand your vote, and we'll get the head honchos to marshal the votes at the local and general elections, which is what happened. And in the time preceding that, of course, you'd had many rebellions, particularly of working class Muslim youth, against racism and against this kind of marginalisation and segregation. In Bradford, you'd had the Bradford 12, who'd been put on trial for trying to defend the Muslim community against an incursion by the National Front. They ran the defence of self-defence is no defence in court, and the jury acquitted them all. But that was a foundational affair. Around that time, you had a huge row over schooling of South Asian / Muslim kids. In the schools in which they were concentrated, they were decrepit schools with no resources, with a lack of teacher training. They got a terrible education. And then in the midst of it, in a school in Bradford called Drummond Middle School, you had, quite typically actually, a head teacher who was totally hostile to the children that he was in charge of teaching. So Ray Hunniford basically said the reason for the poor performance of South Asian children in his school was not to do with his crap leadership or his inability to fight for resources for them, but it's a fault of their parents, who were basically backward peasants from Mirpur, whose culture was basically holding the children back. The parents tried to get him sacked. The local education authority refused to do it. He polemicised in ultra-right-wing magazine called the Salisbury Review, and it unleashed also at that time an early debate on the failure, supposedly, of multiculturalism, and how actually what these children needed to do was assimilate into British values, and they'd do much better for it. So, foreshadowed a whole number of debates in a lot of ways. Now, in a period before that, you had the Asian youth movement, which had taken to the streets against racism, had united under the banner of black political activism, where black and white and brown were under, if you like, a united front against racism and fascism. The Southall youth movements, in one sense, had taken the correct stance, which was to say, we don't denigrate our parents, But to be honest, if we're going to defend ourselves, we need some radical action. We can't just keep our heads down. We need to get on the streets. We need to organise. We need to build alliances. Now, some on the left, in the aftermath of the Rushdie event and if you like, the rising British Muslim identity, decried the whole thing and said that this was a terrible development, the rising of a British Muslim identity, that in actual fact we should be against separate schools. Now, interestingly enough, I do remember at the time being sent up by Socialist Workers SWP's Central Committee to, I think it was Blackburn, to argue that actually Muslims deserve parity under the law. There were religious schools for Jewish students, there were religious schools for Catholics, there was religious schools for the Church of England. Why couldn't there be grant-maintained religious schools for Muslims? It's not in one sense that I was set up to argue for separate schools, but for the right of Muslims to have parity under the law, which in one sense was what they argued around the blasphemy laws as well. I do remember having, I wouldn't say I was chased out of Blackburn, but the comrades were not sympathetic to my argument. Maybe I put it in the wrong way, to be honest, you know. Because, to be honest, we were all trying to develop arguments which we hadn't had to develop before. And, you know, a lot of Muslims, a lot of comrades, I think, hadn't been equipped to have a sophisticated understanding between the relationship between class, race and religion, which thankfully now we've had time to kind of work out. Yeah? And you know, there was, you know, all sorts of debates going on in this time, but the notion that the British Muslim identity, I remember a guy called Keenan Malik, who's still around, who was basically arguing this is a terrible thing, that, thank you, I'm going to shut up now, that this arising of a Muslim identity, that wasn't it better in the good old days when you went on a demonstration against the National Front and us Sikhs and Muslims and the SWP and whatever it is, we'll go down a pub and sink a few pints or whatever it was. Those were the good old days. But, of course, I think what he misunderstands is it wasn't the case that because Muslims were joining a united front to fight racism, and understood in one sense that it was a question of fighting racism, which was the important thing to do, and therefore anything that got in the way of that got effectively in the way of fighting racism. It wasn't that they were irreligious in terms of being in that movement. Basically, they kept their religion out of it because they didn't see it as being. If they asserted their religious identity inside that, then of course that would weaken the anti-racist movement. I'll end on this. I asked Tak Mahmood, who's one of the Bradford 12, what was the kind of relationship between, if you like, race, class and religion in those times, and he said this to me. And I think it's quite interesting. He said, most of the people in the youth movements were religious, but religion was not an issue for the members. It was their own affair. Many Sikhs, Hindus and Christians helped to protect mosques, as Muslims did Gurdwaras when they were attacked. We had very close relationships with Gurdwaras and mosques. There are many among the Muslim members who kept all fasts. The unity was anti-racism and anti-imperialism. One of the Bradford 12 came to me about the question of God. 2 weeks later, he was in jail as part of the Bradford 12. Any divisions political, either Labour Party or the left, or caste or national. And so in one sense, it wasn't a desecularisation of the movement. If you like, the rise of a Muslim identity was to try and find something positive, a positive anchor point, if you like, out of, a pride in, if you like, out of the fact of being faced with an onslaught of Islamophobia. And if you look today, of course, although the Rushdie experience was a negative experience, we didn't have a foothold. The middle ground disappeared, and so on and so forth. But actually, in one sense, if you look at the Muslim identity amongst young people today, if you fast forward to Stop the War campaign, you can see actually how, if you like, the positive aspects of that identity clearly played a major role in building one of the biggest demonstration, anti-war demonstration, or the biggest demonstration in British history. So I've got no more time left. I'm sure you've got lots of questions and things like that, lots of debate amongst you, but I hope that's set out, if you like, a framework for Rushdie 30 years later.
I'm from Bradford and I grew up with a lot of this, and it's a little bit of a stroll down memory lane about some of the things. And something about the segregation. There was real segregation. At the mills at the time, there were still shifts which were all white and shifts which were all people from the Asian subcontinent, with deliberate use in terms of division. There were certainly estates, schools, which were entirely white, but preceding that there was a stupid attempt by the council to butt in Asian kids to the white schools. A mate of mine was there, had a terrible experience there. But I do think, certainly at the time, there wasn't the segregation in schools that the predominantly Asian school, and the Manningham, the area which was seen as being the Asian area in Bradford, was I think 60% white. And I had a number of school friends who were both members of the Asian Youth Movement and the Anti-Nazi League. And certainly in the early 80s, there was a feeling of people coming together in fights. What I think happened was some of the subjective factors of things like the Honeyford affair, where a lot of liberal white opinion went on the side of the racists, but also the defeat of the miners' strike. The idea that whereas in the 80s we were together fighting racism in big campaigns, towards the end of the 80s there was a feeling Thatcherism is predominant, we can't fight ourselves. In that circumstances, an alienated Asian youth who feel no one is going to fight for us, we're going to fight for ourselves, is, as I said, a good thing which took a bad form. It was really the welling up of not waiting to anybody else to fight for them. It wasn't about Rushdie. It was about systematic policing policies, council policies, and so subjective factors of racism, which was hitting people in Bradford, which came as known. I think it's interesting what's happened in Britain different, to say, compared to, say, France, Germany and other places, which the experience of the anti-war movement and the experience of other campaigns where different people that have come together. We had the talk in the German delegation last night. People were really impressed, the number of young people of colour speaking at Marx and the number of people attending. The fact that there is a young militant Asian Asian youth here who are fighting for themselves is, I think, as I said, it is a product of something which started to go in the wrong direction, but provided necessary self-confidence, which actually has resulted in much better things.
Hello. Yeah, I also grew up in Bradford, and I was at school at the time, and I come from a mixed heritage where a large part of my family are South Asian Muslims, and this had a very big impact on me at the time, growing up in that city. But I don't want to just reminisce about that. I want to talk about where it came from, because actually the majority of Muslims who were involved in the protests against the book had never read the book, knew very little about Salman Rushdie, and none of it was really about the content of the book. As the last contributor said, it became a symbol of the offence that Muslims felt that they were under. And I think to understand that, you have to understand how racism was changing at that particular time. You had Margaret Thatcher talking about how we were threatened a bit by being swamped by people of a different culture. And I think Salman Rushdie was a qualitative shift in the way in which racism operated, and the beginnings, actually, not just of the Muslim identity, but as Hass says, of that being imposed on Muslims by the beginning of the creation of a particular form of racism around Islamophobia, where it was specifically aimed at Muslims. And if you think about the Ray Honeyford case, one of the things that Ray Honeyford talked about was he attacked the way that Muslim girls dressed in schools. Now, 30 years later, we're used to this sort of racism, but at that time it was the beginnings, in lots of ways, of that turning into a very specific form of racism. The other thing you have to remember is what was happening on an international scale at this time. This was towards the end of the Cold War and the beginning of imperialism reshaping itself in looking at resources in the Middle East. It's no coincidence that it was only a couple of years later that we saw the war in Iraq and what happened in the Middle East, which has been a battleground for Western imperialism ever since then. So from the state and from the media, the creation of an enemy within who are Muslims fits very nicely with the creation of an enemy without, which are people in the Middle East who then the British state has a right to attack, to bomb, to criticise, to attack, and all of those things. And I think for many of us, that was the beginnings of this, an understanding of how this sorts of racism works. And 30 years later, it's a disgrace that we're still fighting these sorts of racism. But the left is better at it, but we can't take it for granted. And every fight has to be fought on the specifics. And we have to continue to forge the unity of Muslims, non-Muslims, black and white together to fight those attacks.
Hello. I've been living in Barcelona for 25 years, and I'll come back to that. But this time I was living in Britain. And I remember debates we had in the SWP, in fact, about Muslim schools and Cat Stevens. And I remember the stuff about Rushdie. I was then working in a further education college. And something Hassan sort of slipped over lightly, that there were comrades that attempted to put a statement together, Friends of Salman Rushdie. And we tried to collect signatures and collect money to put an advert in the newspaper. And I'm working at FE college, had a bit of success. People, yes, I'll sign that, I'll support that. And then as the debate shifted, as Hassan described, it became clear that even that well-intentioned statement was actually not the right thing to be doing, and it was withdrawn. I remember going to people at my college saying, because a whole wave of Islamophobia that's coming, that of course we don't want Rushdie to be killed, but we don't want to just line up with that. And they said, but what's the problem? He's being attacked, so we defend him, and all these Muslims. So for me, that was like my first serious encounter, if you like, with that sort of liberal secularism, racism. And the thing now, in a lot of Europe, and I've seen it even in Barcelona, that people on the left coming out with those same arguments as you could hear 30 years ago, and you probably still hear in Britain, but people on the radical left still think, but because I'm secular, I'll have just to fold my arms when the Nazis attack a mosque, it's just madness. So I think those debates we've had over the years, and debates we'll have these days at Marxism, I think are very important. They're not just philosophy, they're not theory, they're about how do we fight against oppression and against the system here and now.
I'm not from Bradford, but I was living in Leeds at the time when this erupted. My father bought a copy of the book when it first came out here, and he was reading it and got halfway through and came back after an afternoon walk to find that his wife, my mother, had burnt the copy. Now, my mother is a very nice, respectable Tory voting woman. And I think that when she did that, and I remember being so shocked myself, and my dad was so horrified, that gives you an inkling of how really, really, really pissed off and miffed someone like my mother was about the gross sense of indecency and assault and offence that this book represented. The other thing that was also incredible about that time is that in late 89, the women's club thing that my mother used to go to, and these coffee house mornings that she had with all these nice other respectable women, some of whom were Asian, some of whom were white, etc. When they'd heard that she had done this, the narrative that came out of them was all about how, you're siding with these Hitler-loving, book-burning zealots, etc., etc. And that really came as also a huge shock to my mum, and also underlined everything that Hass has outlined in his talk in terms of how the events of 30 years ago really helped to foreground the crap that we've now come to accept at a daily basis in terms of Islamophobia. But the other thing I just also want to say is that Esme and others have already mentioned this, that most Muslims, sadly, had not read the book at the time. And whilst, in my own view, it's one of Rushdie's poorest books in terms of actually the quality of his writing. His earlier stuff on shame, Midnight's Children, was so much better any day. But there was also one other thing about this book. Again, in Rushdie's, magical realist sort of sense, he did also in the book attempt to grapple with what it was like for second-generation Asians growing up in Britain under Thatcherism, having to negotiate what it was like in terms of racism, which was growing. So it's not the sense that Rushdie wasn't wasn't aware or sensitive to this. But what was also sadly the case is that, Rushdie, when he first published Midnight's Children and then Shame, he really was part of that canon of sort of, lefty, third worldist writers who were very firmly on the side of the oppressed. What tragically happened with Rushdie, not necessarily as a result of his own doing, but particularly because of the kinds of people like Fay Weldon, oh God, I've forgotten his name now, the guy who... Yeah, but these sorts of people, because they championed him as a cause célèbre, he ended up accepting their support and siding with them, and you really began to see the shift in Rushdie as an individual who had sided with oppressed groups away from that. And that's something, again, that I think we have to remember.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about... I was at college at the time when that book came out, and I remember that for the first time, young Asian people could talk about being Muslim and being angry. I think that was the thing about that whole period, is it was the first time it was acceptable for us to come out and talk about racism. And I remember I was doing sociology A-level at the time. We were discussing it with the teacher, and she was trying to tell us to stop being so angry. And I remember the sheer shock that she couldn't understand why a bunch of us in the room felt so angry and so alienated by wider society. And I think that's why you saw so much of the movement on the streets and the burning of the book, where people, like you said, hadn't read it. And I think that really gave credence to people's anger and actually resulted in the confidence that we saw around the anti-war movement. And I think we've had some real victories coming from that period where actually it was interesting that the people that supported Rushdie ended up being the right, and actually gave Muslims even more reason to be angry, because they recognised that actually he then had, maybe because he was being pushed into that position, but actually that's what ended up happening, and therefore really supported their position that he was against them in a way. Because, when you've got Tory ministers coming out saying we must support him, where's that going to go? And I think it's a shame that actually the left didn't have a space to intervene, because I think things would have been very different if they had. However, I think moving a couple of years forward with the Iraq War, and you can really see the left coming out and joining forces. And really, I think someone said earlier that the left didn't have the sophistication. I think you said it. The left didn't have the sophistication to have the arguments. And I think really the SWP really led in shaping some of those arguments during the anti-war years. I remember joining Stop the War in Manchester, and people saying to me, "Oh, we're not interested because we think the SWP are working with people like you, and you can't possibly be liberal," even though I agree with everything you've just said, "but because you're a Muslim, we can't possibly work with Stop the War." And that has continued. But I just want to say, we had some great victories during the anti-war movement, but actually you're seeing the rise of the alt-right today, and we're having some of the same arguments now. I was at a Northwest Stand Up to Racism workshop in Manchester, where somebody from the alt-right said, I completely support a woman's right to choose, but why do you in this heat have to wear that thing on your head? And someone in the left in the room said, well, actually, we do need spaces where we can have these discussions. And I was like, actually, no, there is no space for a man to ask me why I choose to dress the way I do. So you know what? We made some victory. We've had some successes, but actually the fight has shifted. The clothing that far-right are wearing now are different from the Tory ministers and the thugs in the street of the NF, and we have to be prepared for that and change our arguments as well.
Yeah, it was me who had to take the letter round and to try and get a defence of Salman Rushdie, but also set up and argue against the racism and the Islamophobia. Actually, to be honest, we didn't even have the term Islamophobia at that time. It was racism that we used, but now obviously we talk about Islamophobia, and it became very, very clear how hostile people were, rather than the defense. When you were taking the letter, it was, 99% Rushdie and 1% at the most anti-racism, and you knew that something was terribly wrong in terms of what's taking place. The other issue is also 88. Let's not forget, we've come through defeat of the working class, the mining community in the north, right? Yorkshire is the central principle. Thatcher bashed the miners. The printers, remember them in 86, and Thatcher got elected again. It was, the felt defeat It was only the poll tax later on that we shifted the ground in terms of what was taking place. And a lot of Muslims were part of the anti-poll tax campaign. That was important. But, the other issue is this. I remember this. I remember going to a meeting at the ICA, of all places, with Gareth, and you had on the platform Omi Baba, who is the kind of the postmodernist, he's in the university all over the place, and Hanif Qureshi. And they had the literary there. And, I was there taking the letter there, and you knew the atmosphere was foul in terms of what was taking place. So really, we knew how we had to kind of grapple with it. And the final point is this, that later on, as an organiser for the Anti-Nazi League, I had to go to Halifax, and there was a demonstration organised by the fascists, the BNP, the National Front, and a whole group of those mortally Nazis. And the local comrades did fantastic, absolutely fantastic, to try and unite the local community in coming out against the National Front. And I remember being in this field, and the first, we had the local imam who had, it was very difficult to get imams to say they're going to actually protest. And the local imam said, we as a community need to stand out and be against the National Front in what was taking place. And I remember this, that there was someone from the left who decided that the main argument was against the imam, right? And started heckling when the imam spoke and said they should not be spoken. And we had to say why the imam was very important to be on the platform, why that particular individual was wrong, because together we united that community and shifted, and stopped the National Front and the fascists from marching in Halifax at that day. That is the importance in terms of that relationship.
Okay, yeah. Yes, good discussion. I'm glad Rahul came up and talked about... it wasn't the wrong thing to do. It was the right thing to do. It's just we couldn't pull it off. That was the truth of the matter, because things are polarised so quickly. But it was the right thing to do. And I still would have put my name... Sorry, it was the right thing to do, and I still would have put my name on it, to be honest. Now, people are right to look at the... the thing is, I guess what we didn't realise at the time was, in actual fact, there was the beginnings of a modern resurgence of Islamophobia to do with a recolonisation of the Middle East beginning to take place. And we didn't have the terminology necessarily, although, if you look now, the term Islamophobia kind of was around, maybe in academic circles and so on and so forth. But if you think about it, we have a series of events internationally, and this is why I'm going to talk about the global just one little bit, just to fill in some of the gaps. So you had, for example, the Iranian Revolution, and how that threatened, if you like, the whole position of oil and the West's grip on oil in the Middle East. In the previous period to that, you'd had OPEC, which was the organisation of oil-producing Middle Eastern countries, had tried to ration, if you like. They're trying to drive the price of oil up. And what they basically said was that Western countries would have to pay more for it, and they were going to kind of ration it out or slow production of it to kind of, if you like, in Western governmental terms, it was holding the West hostage. So there's a notion of, if you like, Arabs, Muslims being devious, holding the West hostage, trying to undermine our society. And then, if you like, you had instances of further reaction taking place. In Pakistan in 1977, General al-Haq led a military coup and overthrew the government, and as part of the new government, he imposed Sharia law as a legal framework on the Pakistani state. So all this, and obviously, that had huge impact as well. And so, if you like, even in those days, you had this kind of toing and froing between the local you know, the young people or whoever it was in Bradford or Burnley, wherever it is, and what was happening in the Middle East, even in those times. And what's very interesting, actually, if you look at some of the polls which were taken at the time, young people were hardest against Salman Rushdie than the older people. So the notion, actually, that it was, you know, it was all the clerics were leading this was not the case. But also, as people have said, what it probably demonstrates is the incredible frustration and bitterness which was boiling over with the Asian youth seeing absolutely no future, being battered day in, day out on a local, regional and national level, being sidelined and so on and so forth. And if you like, Rushdie providing the catalyst for that explosion of anger. Now, whatever the struggles of my conversation with the comrades in East Lancs at the time, to be honest, at least the SWP was trying to grapple with it. They were trying to understand what was going on. I remember, you know, a few years later, Chris Harman going away and then coming back with A Prophet in the Proletariat, which was trying to, if you like, provide a proper Marxist analysis of the relationship between religion and society and revolutionary change. To be honest, and you know this, most of the left were bloody awful, right? And in one sense, I don't know whether they could have, you know, if the left had been united around our principal position, we would have made more impact. But to be honest, it wasn't bloody helped, actually, by the left. And I'll tell you this, I remember some of the founding conversations of the Stop the War committee, where virtually all of the far left wanted qualifications on Muslim involvement in Stop the War. Yes, this organisation can be part of the Stop War Steering Committee if they denounce Sharia law. They can be part of Stop the War Committee if they do this. In other words, putting qualifications on Muslim participation in Stop the War, which were not qualifications they put on any other organisation who were part of the steering group of Stop the War Committee. So, to be honest, I'm proud to say I think the traditional SWP did learn the lessons and tried to understand what arose out of the Rushdie affair. But to be honest, most of the left took a terrible, horrible, backward looking position on it. Which, to be honest, if they'd won, can you imagine if that argument had won the foundation of Stop the War? How effed we would have been. Do you know what I mean? I mean, really, that's what they're like. And actually, Rahul, and I'll end on this. Rahul, well, it's two things. One is there's a magazine that came out called Muslim Wise, right? And there's a whole number of these magazines that came out at the time. They make very interesting reading because what they are is an assertion, really, of or trying to find a language by which Muslim identity can connect with political movements. So this Muslim Wise, issue number 3, February 1990, so it's about the period we're talking about. Front is Malcolm X, and the headline is "By Any Halal Means Necessary." Yeah, I know. But actually, what it's trying to do is connect, if you like, an emergent young Muslim identity with some kind of political tradition. It's not a retreat from politics. It's attempting to find some kind of bridge within, if you like, an Islamic argo. And also in here we have Beyond Hijab, about 2 young women in a school in Atrium who were banned from their school for wearing the hijab. Back in 1989, they won that particular fight. There was an interview with Michael Palin about his travels across the Middle East. I mean, they're trying to, it's trying to be a popular thing. And this was actually superseded by a much more influential magazine called Q News, which set tradition actually for Muslim kind of political, social journals in this country. And Rahul, reminded me, I was in Rochdale at the time, and it was the local imam who led the anti-poll tax movement. Marched on Rochdale Town Hall, berated the Labour Party and so on and so forth. Because actually, And it was very political. He did it on very political terms. And actually, one of the things was, which we forget about the poll tax, of course, it hit big families hardest. Yeah? There you go. Right? It wasn't to do with race necessarily, but actually, Muslim families who tended to have a few kids, not as many as my family, but which was 12, but tend to actually quite have more than national average, let's put it that way, right? Were hit hardest by the poll tax. And actually, it was very interesting. The Imam in Rochdale was the backbone of the poll tax movement. So, you know, we can look at reactionary elements of it. We can say all that, and we're absolutely right to say that. But at the end of the day, it wasn't a retreat from politics. And I think that allowed that trajectory, which was then picked up by the Stop the War sometime later, we have to say, to materialise. And that's also, and obviously that's very important for our modern times. So there you go.